Firstly, what is GM food? It stands for genetically modified food. It is basically organisms which have genetic material, also known as DNA, that have been altered in an unnatural way. The technology used to do this is known as modern biotechnology. The process involves selected individual genes being transferred from one organism into another. So, a little history behind GM food. It was first approved for release in 1994. The first ever product was the Flavia Severe tomato. The tomato was modified to have a longer shelf life by inserting anthocyanin genes which delays ripening. However, GM food goes far back as 1970s when researchers and scientists first discovered methods of transferring antibiotic-resistant genes from one type of bacteria into another, making the recipient bacterium equally antibiotic resistant as the donor. This research and development continued into the 1990s when finally the first product was commercially released. Later, in 1998, a scientist from the UK challenged the safety of GM food on a British TV program. This caused the sale of the tomato to plummet, and eventually it was removed from the market in 1999. However, during this time, GM food was also saving a group of people's cash cow. In Hawaii, papaya ring spots virus nearly wiped out the crops. The virus first hit Hawaii in 1940s and by the 1990s had reached almost every area that grew papayas. This caused the production to fall by about 50% between 1993 and 2006. Thankfully, Gonzalez, a Hawaiian-born scientist at Cornell University, developed a genetically modified papaya known as the rainbow papaya, which was designed to be resistant to this virus. In today's industry, the most common GM foods are corn, soya bean, potatoes, and papaya. This food have been genetically modified to be insect resistant, herbicide tolerant, and to increase yield. So, what are the pros and cons of the said GM food? We'll start with the pros. Manufacturers use genetic modification to achieve desirable traits in food. For example, they design 2 new varieties of apples which oxidize less when cut or bruised. The reasoning behind this modification is to make the crops more resistant to disease as they grow. Manufacturers also engineer produce to be tolerant of herbicides. The main rationale behind this is crop protection. Basically, plants that are more resistant to disease spread by insects or viruses would result in higher yields for farmers. Now on to the cons. GM food has the potential to trigger allergic reactions. This is because they may contain genes from allergens. The World Health Organization discourages genetic engineers from using DNA from common allergens unless they can prove that the gene itself does not cause the allergic reaction. There is also a concern that genetic modification, which can boost a crop's resistance to disease and make it more tolerant to herbicide, could affect the ability of the consumer to defend against illness. This is due to the small chance that the gene in the food can be transferred to the cells in the body or bacteria in the gut, as some GMO plants contain genes that make them resistant to certain antibiotics. This resistance could be passed on to humans. With all these cons in mind, let's move on to the effects GM food has on the environment. Firstly, toxicity is a huge issue surrounding chemical pesticides and herbicides that are used commonly with GMO. GMOs may be toxic to non-target organisms such as bees and butterflies. Bees are hugely important in the pollination of many food crops, but are unfortunately extremely endangered by modern agriculture techniques such as GM crops. Monarch butterflies specifically are at risk from GMO maize plants. Finally, biodiversity, while it's critical to all ecosystems and sustainability of all species, is put at risk by GMOs. When GM crops are planted, many heritage seeds are no longer in use. The nature of GMO means fewer wheat flowers and therefore less nectar for pollinators. Furthermore, toxins released into the soil through the plant will cause will result in fewer soil bacteria, which is integral to healthy soil for plants to grow without the use of fertilizer. Toxic residues are also left in the soil by the GM crops. Nutrients are then not returned into the soil, and this would mean that the soil becomes dry and void of all nutrients. A cycle of dependence on GMO seeds and chemical fertilizers, pesticides and herbicides is then created to grow a single crop. So, with all these issues brought to light, is it important to have labels on GM food? Yes, of course it is. It all starts with traceability. Traceability enables tracking of GMOs and GM food products at all stages of the supply chain. Traceability also makes labeling of all GMOs and GM food products possible. It allows for close monitoring of potential effects on the environment and on health. Where necessary, it also allows for withdrawal of products if there's an unexpected risk to human health or the environment. So now, let's move on to people's opinions on GM food. GM food has raised a lot of controversy in the recent years. However, there's a significant number of people who support GM food. Recently, WFP received donation of food for the use in Southern Africa, some of which contain GMOs. Several governments have accepted the donated foods without any reservation, while the rest had expressed their reservations on receiving food containing GMOs and sought the advice from the United Nations. According to the United Nations, the decision with regards to the acceptance of GM commodities as part of food aid rests within the recipient country. And WFP policy is that all donated food must meet food standards of both the donor and the recipient country and all applicable international standards and guidelines. So as for the public's opinion, in Singapore, a nationwide survey conducted in 2011 showed that while many were not clear what GM foods are, more than half of the 600 respondents agreed that GM food is of better quality and half of which would consider buying it. So, I for one personally support GM food. I feel that although it has its cons, these cons can be resolved in the coming years by further technological advances or breakthroughs. If GM has the ability to provide better quality food and even aid to poorer countries, I don't see a reason why it should be banned. Yes, it has its detrimental effects to the environment, but so does so many other things, like plastic. So I feel that instead of trying to stop GM food, scientists should work towards finding a solution to the issues brought by GM food. Thank you.